It gives me great pleasure to introduce the moderator for tonight's discussion, Liz Nowell. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me from here? Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you for all coming tonight. I realise that traffic has been a bit of an issue, so thank you for all getting here, and there might be a few people that come in throughout the panel discussion. I'd too like to acknowledge that we meet on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past and present. I will just let you know that Rico Rennie unfortunately was unable to join us tonight, but we have been, we're fortunate enough to have Peter Lonergan with us, who has worked with Rico a lot. So leading into that, tonight we're here to talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander public art, and the discussion is titled Building Futures, Remembering Pasts. So I'd just like to start by introducing the panel, who are really knowledgeable and outstanding people in this field. Down the end is Tony Albert, who's a Sydney-based artist and recently, last year, had a show at the Art Gallery of New South Wales and has exhibited extensively nationally and internationally, and has recently been commissioned to do a memorial that honours Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women in this country. Sorry, I was trying to get the wording right. Next to Tony is Peter Lonergan, who is from Cracknell Lonergan Architects, and has a very accomplished architect who's worked on a number of large-scale public artworks, including Tony's Memorial and also all of Rico's public art projects, so he's very knowledgeable about all of that. We're also joined by Barbara Flynn, who's a contemporary art curator and advisor living in Sydney, and she's currently working for the City of Sydney as the curator and manager of public art, and has been transforming the city. We're also joined by Hetti Perkins, who was the, I guess, project manager on the Eora journey, is maybe not the right title, but Curatorial Advisor, and also was the curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art at the Art Gallery of New South Wales for 13 years, maybe? Kind of. Some years. Yeah. And next to me is Jason Wing, who is a Chinese Aboriginal artist, also based in Sydney, and he too has exhibited across Australia and internationally, and was responsible for the work, the Kimber Lane work in Chinatown, which many of you might know, and a major work on the Bay Run in Drummoyne. I'll also just let you know there should be a few slides that come up of images. It's nothing it's just sort of to prompt you in terms of these artworks, so that we're going to be talking about. So I think we just start by talking about the Eora journey, which the City of Sydney commissioned Hetti and Julie Cracknell to undertake research and put together a study looking at Aboriginal art in the public domain, and Aboriginal culture, I should say. So Hetti, maybe you'd like to start by telling us about how that came about and what the outcomes were from that study.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Sebastian, for that welcome. And I think we're all really pleased to be here. And so this is a bit of a trip down memory lane, even though it's only a couple of years ago. It's still a bit of a test. So the Eora journey has come out of the Sustainable Sydney 2030, and a number of key sort of outcomes, or wish lists, if you like, were drawn up then on the basis of consultation with the community, and one of those was something like recognition in the public domain. And so then there was this great work done. This cultural mapping project was done by Steve Miller to record the places in the City of Sydney, LGA, if you like, or boundaries that are sites of Aboriginal significance, both past and present. And that resulted in a work, a booklet, and a whole body of research called Bryony Burragaboo, which is a fantastic resource, and it really does. It helps. It's become part of this sort of basis of knowledge that the city's been drawing on, and that includes the Bryony website. So I think they're doing really great work and important work in that regard. And then so far as this recognition, building on the work of Steve Miller and the History Unit and others in the city, Julie Cracknell and I were commissioned to do a report or a review of contemporary interpretation practice or something like that. And so we came up with a number of, kind of ideas, talking to people, what was around and perhaps what could happen. And one of the things, I guess, that was the sort of kernel of the report really was asking a lot of people what is their idea of good public art. What should it be? What is the best example of public art they've seen, for want of a better way of putting it? But we're just trying to drill down to what it is that, captures people's imaginations. And a close colleague and friend of mine, Brenda Croft, actually said, well, I think the Aboriginal flag is the best piece of public artwork I've ever seen. And I thought, and it does, because it performs so many functions and it has, a universal meaning, but then a lot of people have their own different responses to it. I thought it was a really great way of understanding what something like that, what public art could be and should be. And then another key project, most of the projects come out of people's suggestions, I'd have to say, and I'm just trying to think of what they all are now. We started the Redfern Terrace last year, I think it was.
That work.
Yeah.
So,
oh, is that it there? Yeah.
Yep.
So that was, again, Rico Rennie was commissioned to obviously paint this terrace, which is on the corner of Hugo and Carolyn Streets, and he worked with a number of young local artists in realising this project, coming up with a design. Throughout the course of it, there was a number of workshops and so on. We're working with some of the young people that are involved with the Tribal Warrior Project, and with Shane Phillips, and that was the. Sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. So they did stencil workshops and did a whole lot of other activities, and then came up with this proposal and then realised it. So that was fantastic, because fortuitously this terrace on the corner of Hugo and Carolyn Streets is a city-owned property, and it's kind of survived all of the development there to date. So we're looking at potentially turning that into something like a local history sort of museum, keeping place, but that's something that this project was kind of just to sort of announce that the site was there. There'll be a lot of, there will necessarily be a lot of community consultation before any kind of plan or scheme for that building is actually resolved and sort of, put in progress. So that's one of them, the Redfern Terrace. There's the Place Projections, which was Nicole Forshew successfully sort of put in a proposal for that work, and that was at the Australian Museum just these last few months on the William Street facade, Born into Darkness Before Dawn, and that was a fantastic work by Nicole, a young Wiradjuri artist, and I don't know if many of you got to see it, but it was a really, really beautiful work.
Was it the Harbour Walk and the...
Oh yeah, then there's a number of walks. So a Harbour Walk, the Eora Journey, which is, will potentially take you from the harbour and through to Redfern. A Redfern tour, sort of just through, Redfern Street itself, potentially working with the terrace. And Monument to the Eora, which is a very big, ambitious working title, only proposal. So that is something that is still yet to be, the brief for that is yet to be drawn up, and all of the proper consultation undertaken for that. One project that we're very, and I should mention that a lot of this work is done by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Panel of the City of Sydney, so that is fantastic for someone like myself working in this area to be able to have that group of people that have all of that, expertise and guidance to offer, and that's always, proved really invaluable, as well as the Public Art Advisory Panel of the City of Sydney. And then, of course, we have a project that is underway, which is really exciting, as Liz mentioned. Tony's proposal to create a memorial to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women who have served their country. And I suppose
we'll talk about that.
Leave you to...
Yeah, before we talk about that, I think I think a lot of people here would be really interested to hear about that. I just wanted to hear from Barbara in terms of how the Eora journey sort of fits into the wider vision for the City of Sydney and the sort of public art, vision for this city.
Sure. Actually, Hetti and I have an equivalent role. We're both called Curatorial Advisor, and I'm actually looking at a really specific geographical, you could say, site or a couple of sites. The city centre, in particular, we've started with expression of interest. Many of the artists here will know there was a big effort to make you all aware of Project for George Street. So the north-south running spine of George Street, 2.6 kilometers of a street. And the other brief we started with, we call the East-West Connectors, those streets that cross George Street, with artists ultimately allowed to decide which they wanted to address. So again, we're equivalent, but I'm very interested in what Hetti's doing. Hetti's project is all across the city. Mine's very specifically located, in a way, well, not in a way, but paralleling the topography and the actual geography of the city itself. I'm very open. There's actually a project which we're thinking of for one of those locations along George Street that could be a collaboration between what I'm doing and what Hetti's doing, which I think would be very exciting, and I hope that will be the first project that's realized. I can say that we're well advanced, and I think that what will end up getting done in the city centre will be absolutely extraordinary. We were very fortunate, had a phenomenal expression of interest with, breaking all the records of the city, 400 submissions, and an extraordinarily qualified and just inspiring pool, some of the greatest artists working in Australia and around the world, and also very even, Australians and artists from elsewhere, which was really important. So we set out to achieve that, and I was actually allowed by the city to write personal letters, emails, procurement, which I really see the value of it. It's meant to keep the process fair. But, every step of the way, getting permission, because I realized this would take probably a personal invitation to get artists involved. So, kind of putting your own stamp on it based on the experience that we have. So again, I would hope that that Hetti's project will overlap this in many ways. And these are just the first two sites. We'll go on to address other sites, but again, in that quite clearly defined city centre.
I think, I think it's really interesting to see what's going on in the city at the moment, and I really commend the City of Sydney for the amount of support they've put behind all of this. It's phenomenal. And I think Tony's project that he's currently working on at the moment, the memorial, the artwork honouring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women who served this country, is, a timely, historical and, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for an artist, and such an important memorial, to be it's finally happening. And Tony, I was wondering maybe if you could tell us a bit about the memorial. There was a picture just before that flashed up of it. It's due for completion in early next year, mid-early next year. And Tony, perhaps you could tell us a bit about the work, and also Peter, as an architect, working with Tony, talk a bit about how you're approaching it, and just hear a bit from both of you.
Oh, thank you very much. I feel a bit fraudulent sitting up here. This is my first public art piece I've been involved in, but I do understand and acknowledge the significance of it. It is very long overdue, and I have to mention it here, the Coloured Diggers of Sydney, who have been so passionately, fighting this city for something like this to happen, and for their understanding, or to the broader community as well, that the memorial that stands actually does not acknowledge or reference the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community and the importance of this. So when the tender came about, I actually was super interested. I'd been working very closely on my own family history, which involved my grandfather being a prisoner of war in Germany. When he returned, 7 of his 8 children served for the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, and our family has over 80 years collective history in the Australian service. And prior to that, I had been a official war artist with the National War Memorial, going on tour with North Force, which is Border Security and Sea Patrol in the Northern Territory of Australia, and made up of about 60 to 70% Aboriginal men and women, but on the ground working up there, it's up to about 80%. So there's incredible opportunities to be involved within that, and it was quite a big process, and one of the biggest selection panels that the city had ever undertaken as well, because of the amount, I guess, of stakeholders involved. This was more than just the chance to put up a piece of public art. It was a memorial, a war memorial. There was many invested stakeholders in it, such as the city, the RSL, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. I guess a massive undertaking, so it was an incredibly lengthy process, and something that for me as an Aboriginal person living in Sydney but not from Sydney also was something that was I guess very interesting to me to look at, as it was a national memorial, yet it was being in Hyde Park. So I'd never done public art before, because I'm incredibly sensitive to the idea of space and place, and that was certainly one of the issues through the consultation with not only the community but through my research of the area, and then my willingness or want or idea I had that I could actually achieve this goal. I was, hopefully or I felt like the right person to do this and give this project justice. So,
and it was a project that you'd had in your mind, obviously not on this scale, but it was an artwork you'd sort of conceived and been thinking about for some time. Yes,
on a much different level. And what a memorial like this, some of the challenges include the fact that these records actually weren't kept or involved of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women involvement. You actually could not register in the Australian Army as an Aboriginal person, so it was very likely that you would have denounced your Aboriginality, or you would have given another nationality as a ruse of being able to be involved. And because of the need for men and women to serve for this country, that was accepted within the army. But the aftermath of it all is that the same as the story of the really heroic story of my grandfather was mirrored in that of all amazing servicemen and women. But when servicemen and women returned to Australia, they were given land as settlement. Aboriginal servicemen and women were actually given no land. Their land was still being taken off them. So there is a great need for recognition of the service that Aboriginal men and women played in this country, and there's a need for people to acknowledge some of the continuing disadvantages that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have in this country because of those things. What we're talking about is not something from a long-lost generation. It's something that's still the cause and effect of that has deep impact on us as people today.
Can you just tell us a bit about what the artwork's going to look like and the story behind it? Because I think that's really important, and people...
Well, I said one of the very tough things was there was no definitive list of people, and when I undertook research at the Australian War Memorial, there's actually an incredible lack of information involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women, and it is something that is growing and something that the memorial has much more interest in. But what I found was that the greatest information I could get of anyone was from families and the actual oral history we have, the abundance of photos that they have of Aboriginal people that were unnamed, portraits unnamed, down to photos that included non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people. Non-Aboriginal people were actually named in the photos and then left as unknown to any of the Aboriginal people in photos. So it wasn't as simple as just getting a clear list as I guess, or as straightforward as a memorial where the people are actually known. And how can we honour all these people without actually knowing who they were? And the answer for me to that was to take one incredible story, which was metaphoric of this journey that everyone had taken, and also how to use that story to reflect not only those issues of war, but the memorial for me was not about glorifying war in any way. It was actually to highlight these issues, but also to continue to talk about the injustices that people have in this country to this date. So the memorial itself is actually 4 standing bullets and 3 fallen. I felt the bullet was a really great symbol, but the story, I haven't heard the story. Well, my grandfather actually, as a prisoner of war in Germany, escaped the prison camp with 6 other men. They escaped over the border of Italy to a small farming village called Bayala, where they were taken in by a farming family and kept safe.
Sorry, that's the work. Well, not obviously the work, but a mock-up of the work.
Secure. Unfortunately, they were captured by Italian servicemen and sentenced to execution. So 3 of the men that my grandfather were with were executed before an officer in charge came out and said that they are British allies and they need to be returned to Germany. So 4 of the 7 men, including my grandfather, were returned back to Germany until the point where the war had finished, given back to British soldiers, returned to England, and then came back to Australia. So the bullets themselves are also metaphorical of the men within that story. The 4 standing bullets are the survivors, and the 3 fallen ones represent those who had passed. And he was actually with an Aboriginal man from Western Australia, was one of the 6 men in it. So there's 2 Aboriginal men actually within that story. So I felt it was and there is a book about this story. My auntie had researched it very thoroughly and found some great records and documents associated with it that was published by the National Museum of Australia. So I feel there was already this very great foundation to it, and felt this was a story that people could read and understand and grasp that effect, but then that whole after effect and that way in which Aboriginal people are positioned now within society becomes apparent within a memorial like this as well. So I guess that was what gave me the strength to put in for the tender.
Yep. I'm interested in talking about community consultation with these projects, because a project of that scale and significance is quite daunting, and it's a big responsibility. And as you said before, there are so many key stakeholders involved in this project. And I think, we've been talking a bit today, and I've spoken to Sebastian about it. I think that there is this real sense when we're talking about Aboriginal or Indigenous Torres Strait Islander public artwork, there's this real sense of sort of community and engagement and ownership, and it's sort of amplified, I think, a lot because there's been so much misrepresentation of Aboriginal people, and continues to be in the media, and sometimes no representation, that people feel this sense of ownership to these work and feel that they represent their community, and as an artist, and as we all know, you do not represent all Aboriginal people. No one represents all people, and that that's sort of a complex issue. And I'm just wondering, perhaps Jason and Peter, working with Rico, everybody on the panel really, how you sort of navigate that terrain in terms of engaging the community and letting them feel ownership over the project while sort of maintaining your own artistic vision and integrity, and how you found the process of community consultation. Because I also know that Jason's experience with community consultation with Aboriginal artworks has been very different to yours. So perhaps, I don't know, do you want to start, Jace?
Yeah, the community consultation is quite difficult. I guess it depends on budget to start with, time frame, and I guess the sort of integrity of the artist and the organisation. But really, budget and time frame is key. I mean, you have to be paid as an artist to do the proper consultation at hourly rates, and often and there's a whole spectrum of jobs too. I mean, there's jobs where you have 3 years lead time, which is great because you can do proper consultation with communities. I know Fiona Foley just did some works in Mackay, and she had over 3 years consultation, and it really shows in the work. I mean, sometimes I've been invited to do jobs where it's very last minute, and they're like, right, you have a month to produce this work, and it's just impossible to do proper consultation because you're already behind the 8 ball. So that's problematic. I've also worked with big developers, and I've actually heard like massive developers, like literally building communities. So I was asked to do a job in a sort of Western Sydney precinct where there actually was no community. They were actually building a community. So that was quite challenging.
And how did you find the community consultation with that?
That particular job was quite bad because it was clearly a tokenistic a procedure, a protocol. That particular job was a box-ticking exercise. Have you done community consultation? Yes, tick, great, move on. So that was quite a bad experience with that particular developer.
So, Tony, I know your experience has been quite different in terms of talking about that tokenistic consultation. You've had quite the opposite. There's been so much community consultation.
There's been massive support for the memorial, and I think, one, it is because it is incredibly long overdue, and people understand and realise that it has been forged forward from the Aboriginal community, more so here in Sydney because this is where it's happening, but all over Australia, and people like Hetti, Perkins, the Coloured Diggers, the RSL have been completely backing it, and then I have an incredible support alongside the Peter Lonergan, the architecture firm, who have historic longevity, not saying you're ancient, in working so closely and correctly with the community. And I guess that is, one of the main differences. But, I wouldn't say this has, the biggest explosive budget going, but it has a lot of heart and a lot of passion involved. And the end of the day, this is for the biggest failure for the memorial is for people not to use it, the community not to use it as a memorial, and that, is what I'm so mindful of, and my greatest fear. Any type of engagement I can do from now until the instigation of the memorial is something that has to be done, and there's a big team of people. And very much including the community. I don't want to say, supporting the community. That actually does include the community that are working towards this goal. And, your role as an artist is sometimes just that vessel of making it happen, to take those stories and build upon it. So, but in saying that, it is a big bureaucratic. I worked 8 years for a major government institution, and for 5 years I've been my own boss, because I wanted to get away from that, and now I find myself back in those office blocks and those meetings, reminding myself why I got out of it. It is incredible, but there are so many very, very passionate people involved, and they all want the best outcome.
And Peter, in terms of Rico's 2 projects in Sydney, really, aren't they? There's Taylor Square and Redfern Terrace. I think was Taylor Square started off as a sort of streetwear project, did it?
So Taylor Square, we were working with Rico on a commissioned work for La Trobe Uni, and the streetwear expression of interest came up while we were working on that, and Caroline at our office saw it and asked Rico if he'd be interested in putting in a proposal, and Rico was, of course, interested in that, and so we put in this, incredibly bold and unaffordable proposal, which, because it was so bold and unaffordable, maybe got chosen as the winning proposal, but. It was this incredibly strong, big idea. And I think with all of the work that we've done with artists, and particularly on public art projects, what I'm astounded by as an architect is that artists are so different to architects, in that artists can distill an idea into one big thing, and really all we then try and do is just kind of, I suppose, enable the realisation of that idea. So Rico's idea was really the text, and the painting of the building in a way was almost a prop to the text, and just the notion that the city would accept something as bold as that is testament to the city council's their true intent and their true belief in a process of reconciliation. To put on a building in the centre of the city that says that the city and the state and the country always was and always will be Aboriginal land is a great, strong, gutsy thing to do.
And the community's really embraced that work. I mean, it's such a popular artwork in all of Sydney, and it really resonates with everyone, I think.
Yeah, there wasn't much public consultation on that.
Yeah.
There was while it was going up and after it had finished. But
most people thought it was something to do with the Mardi Gras.
Yeah. That's why I said
and Rico,
it has wide
Rico was
resonance.
okay with that.
That's what I was sort of getting at. Barbara or Hetti, in terms of community consultation, perhaps Hetti, it's obviously something you spend most of your life probably doing at the moment. Maybe you'd like to tell us a bit about community consultation and sort of, as I said, navigating that terrain between the artist and the community with these large-scale public art projects.
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of things. I mean, one thing I think is that the community consultation is ongoing. It's never ending. It keeps going on that way and it keeps going that way as well. I think also it is challenging, as Jason mentioned, and it's something in my experience that mostly the criticisms or comments and things like that you have in fairly frank and open discussions that are sometimes happening around works are really useful. In my experience, people that say, look, I don't like it because of that or that, they're pretty much right most of the time. I mean, it might be the way it's interpreted or how the artist takes it on board and then responds to it might be slightly different to what they intended, but usually it's really good and really useful and constructive, even though sometimes it's not necessarily framed in what might sound like a constructive way. And then I was thinking too that, for instance, when Peter and I also, and Julie also worked, Curator and Lonergan Architects, on the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris, and a number of artists were involved in that, and that was quite a different, because, I didn't feel it was my job to consult with French people in Paris about what they thought was appropriate, but I was really concerned that when myself and Brenda Croft were asked to co-curate that project, one of the first things that we decided was that we wanted independent architectural advice for the artists, and I think that was actually probably the best decision, apart from the artists themselves, about the curating of that project, because as it transpired, with their English or Guninku or Gidja or whatever language the artists were speaking, to English and then to French, and with a whole lot of working with the site that basically we saw for the first time with hard hats and just this giant pit in the ground, to realising the project that was something. So it's about, I think, again, it's like Peter was saying, it's about enabling the artist, and that's often the case. Obviously you need really strong community consultation, but also to bring that kind of expertise that you can't offer to insulate, I guess, the idea.
I might introduce another project. For the city, I'm an external consultant, but I'm also working on other projects at the same time. About 5 years ago, just got asked to do projects on a monumental scale. And one of them, which will be installed very soon now, mid-May, we've been working on for 5 years, and it's by the great American artist Jenny Holzer. Jenny, you'll be familiar with her work over many years now, has worked with text, used to be her own writing, But as of 2001, she'd go into a country or a place and she'd work with the writing of the people living there. So there was a very strong connection of her work to place. And she won a commission. It's 8 Shifley Square, the building that was completed in October by the architects Rogers, Stirk Harbour and Partner and Lippman Associates here. We had great artists in that competition. She won it and has been working with us, well, her part of it about 3 years now. After much reflection, she decided, and lots of providing her with writings across the board, huge consultation. We put together a kind of advisory panel of, literate people, but also others that we thought could give her good direction. She came to the position of wanting this work to be 100% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writings. And it's been a very complex project involving text permissions, for each piece of writing that she selected. Some had to fall out, some people we couldn't find. It was an eye-opener for me because there were some older texts, and you could see that the Aboriginal community, it's a disenfranchised part of society. It was hard to find people. Very elaborate process which we've pursued, actually with incredible application. Couple of really good people from the publishing world that we drew in who've been working on text permissions. Hetti's agreed to be advisor and has been absolutely indispensable to the project. So, imagine this. The structure of the building are diagonal columns, 18 meters up into the sky, all 4 sides, LED messaging. And we know from the process of contacting the writers and their families or, their estates, how moving this is. So right in the middle of the city of Sydney, you will have this work of art. And I think it raises an interesting issue because she's not Aboriginal. So she's someone who came in from outside and early in the process said that the writing that was really moving her were these texts that we were providing her that were by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers. So, consultation, again, Hetti's been guiding us on how to handle that, and we've been very cognizant. This is a public work. This couldn't be more obvious. So certain care, about people who will see it, children who will see it, and a lot of consideration and discussion with the artist and others about this marvelous content.
I just thought, moving on from what you're saying, we're talking about place and how important place is with all of these works. Particularly, I guess, Barbara, the position of these works in context of the non-Aboriginal artworks that we're talking about. So the conversations that come about from all of these artworks being together in this sort of space. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you see that, or you and Hetti again, if you feel like there's a conversation between these works. If there's, particularly you're saying it was Jenny, wasn't it? She's sort of engaged she's engaged Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers, I guess. And I think that there's an ongoing conversation. I hope that these works, whether they're Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, international, Australian, that they sort of speak to each other. And I guess as a curatorial advisors, do you see the city as sort of a puzzle where all the pieces fit together? All the public artworks sort of fit together, and in terms of sites, does that sort of make sense? Do you see the broader sort of works, how they all fit together as one, or do you see them as all being very separate and there's conversations, or how the works interact with each other, I guess? Is that a tough question?
Over to you. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting. I don't know that there's very few opportunities to sort of sit back and get the bird's eye view of a city and to see how these works all relate to each other. And of course, it's a particularly exciting time, I think, for anyone to be working in this area with what the city's doing, different initiatives that are institutions, developers, and so on that are taking upon themselves to make happen, if you like. Of course, there's Barangaroo, which, if it survives the fire that's burning through it at the moment, will be bringing another kind of uncharted water. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's always struck me that there's a lot more to the fabric of the city than we kind of actually know about that's sort of publicly available. And so that's why in the Eora journey there's three proposals are sort of kind of walks or tours that are potentially, one is they're all different kinds of things. Well, some are led, some are self-guided, and then others, it's an artist-created kind of interpretative project. And I think one of the things is that with the Eora journey, in my mind anyway, I've always been very clear about the fact that the Eora journey, potentially would include a work like Jenny Holtz's. I mean, obviously it includes the memorial, but there's lots of other works. There's, Jonathan Jones's White Lines in Westpac. There's, of course, Jason's work. There's, lots of amazing works. Fiona Foley's Edge of the Trees, of course, with Janet Lawrence at the Museum of Sydney. So there's all these amazing works around the city. And so I see the Eora journey as being the opportunity for this, this more recent modern Sydney story, if you like, to be seen within the bigger picture, which is this Eora story. And we take we've in consultation with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander panel and so on, the Eora journey is been very clearly defined to be the people's journey, and Eora meaning the people. So I guess I see the jigsaw puzzle, if you like, as being a kind of an Indigenous and Aboriginal landscape, and there's these kind of non-Indigenous bits in it, and how we can, link them all together. So I think that's probably somewhat of a different way of seeing it as it has been before. And of course, as people point out, Sydney is well before the First Fleet got here, and still today it is this incredible public art gallery. I mean, there's amazing work all over Sydney, and as a friend of mine, pointed out to me the other day, and at Bondi Headland, there's amazing rock art just there. And so it's something that I think, it's looking at those, layers of history and artistic energy. And of course, Sydney is really uniquely placed to continue that tradition. Yeah.
I just love the statement by Barbara, that it's just really, really hard, and just to acknowledge that. But it is so easy, and we see it in the art world we live in at the moment, that it's very easy to take a colonised view and say, well, actually, we're all owners of this. Dots don't belong to everyone, or to only one person. Raking doesn't belong to only one person. Right down to the very words in which we speak, and this idea of this heavy consultation, which is so hard, but it is possible. It takes a lot of time, and we have to slow things down to achieve that. But I mean, that's something I think is of major concern at the moment, and to hear these ideas and just something as simple as, it's really hard, is actually testament to what we can actually achieve.
And Peter, when you're working with artists, I guess I've got my curatorial hat on now, but and when you're working with artists, do you ever think about the public works in context with the works that are around it in that sort of same area, or does that not really feed into the thinking? Or even the culture of that area, I guess.
Well, we're heritage architects as well, so I suppose all of the architectural work that we do is very much informed by history and history of place, and so we're certainly aware of the cultural base into which our work is put. But pretty much when we're working with artists, we don't really do anything other than what the artists ask us to do. So we kind of make kind of manifest their ideas, but we don't really do anything other than that. So It was kind of really interesting working with Tony, because we started working with Tony right from the very start of this this work, and Tony showed us these drawings of of bullets, and I thought, oh, that's so kind of crass, but I'll shut up. And I thought it'd be nice to do something in the pool, a nice fountain or something like that. Some dolphins.
Sure.
But so another thing that architects are really good at is sort of post-rationalising stuff, because architects come up with these kind of harebrained ideas, and then they have to kind of rationalise them. So through our research and our history, and we've got a very kind of big library on Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal kind of history and development of Sydney. We found images and we found a context that we didn't know about, and I assume Tony didn't really know about, and this resonance in Tony's work that none of us knew, and again, that's kind of the thing that artists do, they have this strange ability to kind of pull out things that no one ever knew. So the bullets was kind of a worry, and when it was presented to the RSL, they loved it, but in the research that we were doing, we found all of these bullets that were actually in the stained glass windows in the cenotaph. We found these incredibly blunt and horrific imagery in the cenotaph that was shocking at the time and has sort of faded into history. But the kind of the brutality and the singularity of Tony's idea and good, and the ideas behind all good public art are the things that make public art so great. I don't think they have to be all connected to each other. I just think they have to be great. And I think there's a big difference between fine art that's public art and public art for the sake of it. Like paintings of hot air balloons on old brick walls and things like that. I don't think that's public art. I think that's decoration. I think there's a big difference between the work that artists do and the work that other people do, decorators do.
And just to go to you, Jason, because I know the Kimber Lane work, which was sort of launched in, was it 2011? And you worked on that for quite a long time, and that really is sort of become the heart of Chinatown, and I know the place was very important for you for a number of reasons. So perhaps you'd just like to talk a bit about the site and the place and its significance in relation to that work, and perhaps to you personally.
Yeah, well, I'll start personally. My grandfather worked in his uncle's restaurant in Hay Street, and my grandfather worked there peeling prawns, and my grandmother was an Australian-Scottish waitress, and the rest is history. But we used to meet on Sundays and have lunch together, both sides of the family, so good personal story for me. But it's interesting because I had to negotiate kind of two different types of community consultation, and it was quite a big scope. I had feng shui experts, you name it. There was a lot of people we had to talk to. Not using red and yellow, the traditional lucky colours, and using blue took months to convince people, but we got there in the end. But Haymarket itself is a very significant place. That's Market City used to be markets, but also the storage of hay, and it was one of the first migration waves. And so that sense of place is really important. But getting back to the consultation, as artists, you can only do your best with time and budget. And what I've learned is that you can't please everyone. You have to do the best that you can. You have to be able to sleep at night, so you can consult as much as possible. But at the end of the day, as artists, we were the ones that won the tender. and we have to represent the communities as best we can. So, yeah, I mean, it has to stop at some point. I mean, we could consult for the rest of our lives. I mean, you ask, 10 different people, you'll get 10 different answers. So it has to stop at a certain point. Sorry, what was the question again?
We're talking about the significance of the work Kimberlane and the site in Chinatown and your work that you created there in response to the site. So perhaps you could tell us about the work itself and its relationship to Chinatown.
Yeah, well, the work was the symbolic heart of Chinatown, and so, I mean, that really informed the imagery. I mean, you can see the central circle in the child's chest, and that is an abstract form of the campfire symbol, and also the Chinese elements. And so I was quite lucky. I got to incorporate, 2 different cultures in one work, which was quite amazing. And I felt like I did a pretty good job on both fronts.
I just wanted to talk a bit about, I guess, motivation in all of this, because, we were saying before about this has really become, I guess, this whole concept of visibility in the public domain for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture is really a big thing at the moment in this city, I think, which is great, and everyone up here has sort of been a part of that and contributed to that. And I just wanted to ask, I guess, everyone really about their motivation. And I know that, to come back to Jason, we've had big chats about a work that he has on the Bay Run, is it the Bay Run in Drummoyne, which is a 7-metre serpent.
Yeah.
And perhaps you could just talk about, I guess, your motivation for that work and why it is what it is and why it's important for you to be making this work.
Yeah, well, I feel quite lucky because I can create a very personal and very critical work as an artist, and I think public artwork should be that as well. But when I create public artworks, I feel I shift a lot. So I'm thinking more about how it's going to be received, how the community is going to receive it, rather than me making a personal an artwork for an institution, let's say. So the focus is like 95% community and how it's going to be received, which I really like that challenge. But imagine trying to get into the world's head. But my main goal for the serpent, it's actually very simple. It's just a visual indicator to remind people that we are on Aboriginal land and water. That was my only motivation. It's quite simple. There's not too many deep layers to it. And the reason why I chose the rainbow serpent was because that was it's a symbol that everyone can kind of automatically identify and link back to Aboriginal culture.
And I think it is a simple sentiment, but it's a very important one, I think, and it is about that visibility, which is so crucial. And like you said, that sort of reference to the rainbow serpent is very commonly, that link is sort of very commonly made. Tony, perhaps you could talk a bit about the motivation behind your work that you're doing for the memorial and why it's so important to you, and what's the underlying motivation with that?
Oh, well, I think it was, as I said earlier, that it was my grandfather's story, and it gave me that confidence and it gave me that belief that I could do that. And as I said earlier also, I'm so sensitive to the idea of place and space. This is the first public art work that I'll be doing, and for all intensive purposes, probably the last. But not in a bad way, but that's a sensitivity that kind of bears and stays within me. But I would like to, I love public artwork. I'd like to see it everywhere. I'd like to see things that respond to place, and then I'd love to see artworks by international artists that actually don't have a resonance or grounding on where it is, but it's actually, should be here as part of our collection within Australia, and something to be proud of, owning something that belongs to someone else from outside this country. So I kind of, that's not for me to take on, and not the way in which I would bring it forward, that idea, but that's something I do want to see. And but my grandfather gave me that strength, but then it was the stories that alludes to and brings to the forefront, and for me, which is the most important.
What about Anita?
Okay, sure. It's an incredible consultation that you go through, and when you're thinking about these things, and another attribute was I wanted to take that strong story and make it not only national but universal in a way. This idea of the soldier, and have commissioned Anita Heist to come on board with the project as well, who, if you're unfamiliar, is a very amazing author, writer, academic, and I think that plays into a lot of my practice as well. When I know what I want to do, I often find the best people to do it, and that's not based on race or ethnicity or anything. When I know what I want to do, I pick the very best people we have to work with, and Anita was certainly that person for this project, to be able to, it needed a wordsmith, someone that could articulate what I was trying to do visually in writing. There's landscape architects, community. There's so many people involved. It's actually really fascinating. But it was that feeling that I was the right person to do it, and or a belief that whoever got the project, this is so important, and they would be the right person as well. It needed to happen.
Hetti, in terms of your journey, and what are the sort of, I guess, the goals that really, obviously we've talked about the projects that have come out of it, but what is the essential motivation for the city in doing this and committing to this so much, because they really have so much?
I guess, recognition in the public domain is what they're trying to achieve. And of course that can take many levels. I think there's the, as I mentioned before, the Briny Barragaboos really kind of brought to light the significance of the city itself to Indigenous people. The Australian Hall Foundation for Aboriginal Affairs, there was the Terrell's Photographic Studio down near Wynyard, and so there's all these places, the Hungry Mile and all these places are really significant to Indigenous history, recent history, but then of course where the memorial is going, in proximity to that anyway, at Hyde Park South, is the site of a ritual contest ground that was recorded by some of the First Fleet people, recorded these events and activities taking place there. So there's a really wonderful kind of resonance or echo of Tony's work with those kind of activities in times gone by. And as we know, the roads and paths and things around the city are basically, based on Aboriginal walking tracks. So I guess that recognition in the public domain is something that takes, obviously takes many forms. That sort of cultural mapping, that writing project, that historical research, the work of artists. And I think that it's a very important project, and I think the city, and like you, I really commend the city for taking this work on, and it's great to be able to work, with Barbara and others to realise it. It's a privilege, and it is very scary because I don't feel that I've ever consulted enough, and like you say, you can't please everyone, but it is quite a daunting prospect.
Absolutely.
But I was going to say something, and I've gone right out of my head.
I think what's interesting about all of these works, and particularly with Rico, Tony and Jason's practice as artists, is that they all a lot of your work, much of your work strives to sort of tell historical truths, and I think that really comes through in a lot of your public artworks as well. will come through in yours, Tony. It's yet to be built, but I definitely think that that's sort of an important, probably for you as well, Jason, as you said, talking about visibility and that sort of reminder on Aboriginal land and just being honest in that and you know, offering that historical truth to a wider community, because public art is a great way to, you know, really, like you said, get a message across to a huge group of people.
I mean, I think, sorry, just to backtrack too, one of the things that I think is an important outcome for me anyway is that, you know, it's a bit like an award exhibition, you know, there can only be one winner, but there's what I'm hoping and you know, would love to see come out of it is that artists, for instance, in the, I don't even know how much you're meant to be able to talk about this, but anyway, there was a mix of artists who submitted, you know, some well-known and others who I hadn't known about. And so I think that's fantastic, because even though, if you may not get a Guernsey, but you're sort of, you're in the sort of, you know, you've made an impression, and who knows what things might come down the track. So I see it as a really great way of encouraging the participation of more and more artists in this realm, in the public realm, and bringing works like Jason's, Tony's and others, and Nicole's and all the people we've mentioned and talked about today to the fore. You know, I think that I hope that is something that, you know, our artists can be really inspired by, and also, you know, put their print, whether it's in Sydney or anywhere else, on the landscape in that way.
But it's a harsh process, that process, and I think if you're not an artist or if you're not working with them, you don't really realise how kind of crushing it is to lose. So if you don't win, you lose. And should just get that straight. It's incredibly hard. But if you keep doing it, one day you won't lose. And we've done a lot of, we do a lot of submissions for a number of different artists. We're very lucky to be able to work with such great artists. But we work with a big range of artists. We put the same amount of effort in for each artist, and you know, I believe that each artist have you know, this ability to have these great ideas. But it is crushing to lose. It's there's no.
Well, it's even difficult to win. Or, I mean, I think, you know, what you're saying.
So, yeah, that's right. It's more crushing to win at the moment.
No, but to pull the projects off. And I think, you know, answering your question about motivation, I think, I mean, I would say probably the city's motivation is to include artists very early in these major new infrastructure projects. The response to that has been kind of awestruck. You know, I mean, there was a big reach on the project I'm working on, and the response from people from other places and other cities was that this would never be happening here. So that was quite fascinating to get that kind of feedback. And I guess, you know, probably a company like Mirvac's motivation, the company that is the development company that commissioned Jenny Holzer, that was fascinating, because maybe at the beginning they didn't quite know what their motivation was. But in those projects, what I see happening is that they develop lots of things, but certainly a motivation, a commitment, and they surprise themselves. And it's one of the most marvelous developments you can experience, and probably it's a big motivation for me to see that occur. Happens all the time in these projects. It's a moment when you see that people who, you know, probably didn't know about art are so committed. They really start to own it, and they're very proud of it. And especially with a project that is difficult or controversial, it's a marvelous thing to see. And I do think that it must have a much broader impact on people's lives. And I guess, you know, personally, maybe my motivation, it's very much what Peter said. It's to create a really good working situation for artists, to draw them in, you know, do the stuff that they can't do and they don't want to do. And, you know, we have skills you wouldn't want to have if you're an artist. But, you know, to do that. And I mean, I think for a lot of us up here who are not the artists, it probably is about making things possible for the artists. And more in Sydney, there are these possibilities. I'll say this was quite wonderful. Today, with the City Centre project, we have, our shortlisted artists making site visits, Australians and people from elsewhere. And we were walking, and we walked into your work. And that was a really fantastic experience, because here's this whole body of these projects that have been realized in Sydney. Here are these people from elsewhere seeing the work of an artist from here. We're commentating on it, and it just felt really resolved and kind of thrilling, I have to say. So more and more of those sorts of things are happening, and I think the city does deserve to be commended. I think it's phenomenal what they're doing, and also how long it took them. What we're doing, it's been in the works for 10 years, 12, 15, and a lot of really dedicated people on the inside of the city who've worked very hard to make this happen and sort of build a consciousness within the city so that these projects could be done. It's quite incredible, and I guess we know that from being a little bit on the inside.
I'd also like to commend the city as well. There have been quite a few visionary projects. There's streetwear, which essentially engaged artists, street artists, sculptors, and that was kind of like an entry level, almost like a pilot program for artists transitioning into public art. And I think that was actually one of the most important projects. And I think indirectly, I did a few streetwears, and there was a lot of success stories like Rico's building. That was a streetwear that eventually got proper funding and extended.
And Kimberlane?
Yeah, and Kimberlane a little bit. But I think I got Kimberlane sort of off the back of a few streetwear projects, and I know lots of artists that entered streetwear, and now that's shifted their focus, and that was important for me for Kimberlane. I wanted to present an alternative to the plonk art bronze of some colonial dude. I wanted to incorporate street art and sculpture and installation and actually transforming a space, and I think that. Well, I hope that inspires the next generation of looking at public art a little bit differently. And so, you had streetwear, and now there's art and about as well, which is kind of like the next level. So these kind of temporary laneway projects, which again, when they get a really good response, like the Forgotten Songs, the bird cages in Angel Place, again, that was so successful that they extended it and paid the artists a proper budget to get it fabricated, and so I think that these programs are really important. I think it's really important to recognise these programs because they do support first-time public artists, if you like. Kimberlane was my first project, and Tony's got the memorial, and it's quite visionary, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. We don't want the same usual suspects making this 10 or 20 public artworks, because they just end up being the same. So
everyone's thanking the City of Sydney. It's a very happy moment for the city. I'll open up to questions in a moment, I think. Just wondering, before we do that, if anyone wanted to say anything else, or perhaps talk about the future and what we sort of want to see in public spaces in the future around Sydney. I think the War Memorial, for example, was something that people wanted to see for a long time. So it's great to see that really come to fruition. So perhaps if anyone else felt that they wanted to sort of talk about what they sort of want to see further down the track, or how Sydney sort of evolves and embraces public art. Tony?
I'd like to see a memorial in every state. I'd like to see a memorial in acknowledgement of the wars fought by the first people of this country, and actually understood that this country was never bought, sold or traded. It was indeed invaded at the mass of many Aboriginal murders. But all in all, I want to just see art everywhere. It actually makes such a difference. Art has always always and will continue to change the world, change the way we think. How I know this to be true, I was, a boy from the outskirts of Brisbane. I didn't enter into a public institution till I was an adult, and the dramatic effect that art has had on my life is incredible, and that, visually our lives change. It's proven that contemporary art in hospital changes the will of the patients. Inside various cavities, that the museums need to be looked at as extensions of our lounge room walls. We own the work inside that. We need to be proud of that. And for me, it's more. Yeah. Imagine. I want, something to be painted out white to be considered graffiti. Everything else.
I don't think any of us would say we want less, because then we'll be out of a job. So I think there's definitely always room for more public work, and I agree with you. Does anybody...
No, I was just going to... thinking about consultation, one of the things we haven't touched on is that when we're dealing with City of Sydney, of course, not everything in the City of Sydney is owned by the council. So I think to sort of add into the mix without what I want for the future is that, there's a lot of consultation with property owners too, because, they're just business people. Why would they, they have to invest in the project, give permission, and so it's just another layer of consultation. And so I guess I would say that I hope that successful projects, such as the ones we're talking about, and indeed the many there are in the city, are something that give those kind of private property owners the confidence to be able to, be part of that picture that we're talking about.
And I guess we've talked about government a lot as well, but as you just mentioned, there are organisations, corporations that are sort of more and more embracing public artwork and really taking it quite seriously.
Yeah, we try and trick our clients into putting public artwork in their private buildings as much as we possibly can, and also and we have done that quite a number of times. And some very significant, significant public artworks, and I think it's something that could be written into policy, and I think that there could be, there could be more incentives for people to do that. So more incentives from the council for developers to spend money on public art. We did a little school in Redfern Street and managed to get a life-size bronze of Mum Shell cast that an artist had made the plaster cast for 35 years ago, installed in Redfern Street last year, which is an icon of Redfern Street now, as she was an icon of Redfern for such a long time, such an important part of the life of so many people in Redfern, that when we were installing it, people were just walking into the site crying and touching it, and which they do now sort of every day. And then Roy Kennedy's work on the back of Wyanga, the aged care facility in Cope Street in Redfern, another great kind of touchstone for the Aboriginal people. And when we were doing that work, Roy's etching, of course, was back to front, and we showed it to the elders at the community centre, and they looked at the drawing and they said, it's back to front, you've got to put it in the right way. And so all that we did as architects was, turn the drawing round, as the elders said, the right way, and put it on the wall the way that they remembered this mission in northwestern New South Wales to be. So And we've done a number of other kind of public artworks that kind of add to the street, that have always been more difficult than they needed to be. Difficult from the side of the developer and difficult from the side of the consent authorities to accept or understand who owns it. So there is a sort of a threshold problem there that needs to be kind of addressed, and there needs to be incentives that should be addressed. And programs like maybe the program that was in Queensland up until the last election, where a certain percentage of development of public, the cost of public buildings, be spent on public art, and the enculturation of public space. I think those sorts of things would help, and to not feel bad about chucking out old guns that fell off some ship that they decided to put in the corner of Hyde Park and point up Oxford Street, and old statues of Queen Victoria that the Irish got rid of, and someone rang up someone in Australia and said that they want all these old statues of Queen Victoria. You know, they have no voice. You know, they're kind of meaningless, but they've been enshrined in the sort of European history of the city, and they're irrelevant, really. They looked good when they were painted and had balloons on them and stuff like that, or knitting, like they had little knitted coats on. But apart from that, they're inane, you know. So I think that some policy, some legislation would help.
A bulldozer would be good.
Yeah, bulldozer.
Another bomb. Well, that's why they got rid of them in Ireland, because they were scared they were going to get blown up.
Yeah, I'd like to see more urban parks. That's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see a few less skyscrapers, or actually have a skyscraper that is different levels of parks. That was one of my ideas. A skyscraper garden. The only way is up, I guess. Urban space is an interesting thing. When you go overseas, the majority of the population is outside, occupying space. And it seems very different here in Sydney. Maybe it's because we have a lot of land and our home is a little paradise, but I mean, life is on the streets overseas, and that's where the culture is. There's vibrancy. There's culture is out on the streets. It's not in a little box. So, yeah, I'd like to see a lot more, urban planning for what little space is left in Sydney, and have more communal spaces.
Should I open it up to questions? Does anybody have any questions? I don't know if we have a microphone, or I can't. Okay, great.
Irene is my name. My question goes to all the panelists. You touched upon the future, and I was just wondering, how does Australia compare to other parts of the world in your experience in terms of public art work, the activity that's taking place at the moment? Not just
everyone look to Barbara.
Well, again, what I said, the reactions we were getting about this city centre project were that this would never be done anywhere else. One of the artists, from New York said never, would be impossible in New York City. I think another interesting part of that project was an emphasis, which I guess we repeat, when we're briefing the artists, about how Sydney doesn't have to copy other places. We don't want solutions imposed from elsewhere. And it's kind of fun to talk about that. When I was saying some words about that to this group yesterday, I actually used the word proud. But, I think that is true. I think Sydney doesn't need to copy solutions or things that have been done elsewhere. Absolutely no reason to do that. So, because it has a lot itself, and you can mix in, artists from other places. But, again, what Jenny Holzer ended up doing, where she really understood or tried very hard to understand something about Australia, that I think has been a very worthwhile project. And maybe that's the kind of pressure we're putting on for an artist who's maybe not from here to try to engage in that way. And it's worthwhile, So.
My question, I guess, was more to do with government investment in this space, and also an appreciation from the public. So do you find that the Australian community responds well to that, or more so than other communities?
I probably don't know the answer. My experience with these kind of projects has been in Australia. I worked in the New York art world for many years, but had galleries, was on the other side of what I'm doing now. So I don't know the answer to that. I pay a lot of attention, but I wouldn't say, that I'm an authority.
But I suppose, I'm not an authority either, but in the Depression in the say 1930s, in America, the government opened a whole range of artist schools around the country, and you could do the mural course, or you could do the monuments course and the carving course. And artists like Jackson Pollock, for instance, came through that program, and many hundreds of other artists. And I think most of the European countries look after their artists better than Australia. The Australian government looks after their artists. And there's a great tradition around the world, except in Australia, of public art being the edification of public buildings. So Diego Rivera's work, although all around the world politically these things come in and out of fashion or come in and out of favour, none of that work or those artists would have happened without the support of the government. So I think what the city's doing now is in a way akin to those practices that have been practiced in other countries, but to date not practiced in Australia. So I think it's a great thing when those things become they're taken on by the government at different levels.
Yeah, I totally agree. It seems like Sydney is a very it's a money culture. I mean, being creative overseas is quite a respectable, and generally society really values arts and culture. I mean, maybe it's because we're a young country here, or maybe it's because we're so litigious here in Sydney. Maybe it's the current policies. I know at the moment, if you want to paint a mural on a wall, you need a DA for that. Whereas, if you take Melbourne as a case study, where the local council, they had quite relaxed laws about stencil graffiti and murals, and so it actually didn't cost the government any money at all. They had the best, Melbourne at one stage was the stencil capital of the world, and the income that brought in to Melbourne is probably the largest income, apart from the Olympics. And it didn't cost the government anything, but I think that's a reflection on the policies. But Sydney's definitely improving, and we're seeing that, but it can always be better.
Sydney's got a particularly tough policy on graffiti. I know it's raised quite a few dances and various other well-known artists on school walls. Is there much scope for increasing the volume of public art by way of street art or temporary exhibitions or temporary installations? Is that been raised at all?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know there's a study. I think the city has some people who are doing a project cataloguing graffiti art, and they're very knowledgeable. I don't know a lot about that. I mean, we are quite separated, I think, in our various assignments within the city. But I do know that's in the works. Do you know?
I know.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are other people you could find out, or we could probably help you find out who the people are within the city who know more about that than we do.
There's some good sort of social media sites, like on Instagram. There's a couple of people who are photo documenting all of the graffiti around the city and the inner city, and it's really good. But a few years ago, we were prosecuted because we put a graffiti mural on one of our buildings, and we were prosecuted by South Sydney Council, not this great city council. And it was quite kind of ironic, really, because we rang the council, we spoke to the public art officer, who gave us the name of the graffiti artist, and we put it up, and then someone complained about it, and we were prosecuted, and except for the kind of media furor and the support from the media, we would have had to paint it out. It's still there, but I think because we live in Surrey Hills and work in Newtown, we constantly see great street art erased on a daily basis. Anthony Lister got rubbed out 2 blocks up the street from us a couple of weeks ago. There's some great young stencil art that got rubbed out across the road from our office last week. It's kind of weird, and it seems to be quite kind of pointed too. There's little tags. The graffiti removalists didn't do anything about those, but they attacked these stencil works, that were works of art. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really strange thing. I mean, the councils, and including the City of Sydney, they actually have the best database of street art in Australia because they have to document the work before they paint it out. So they actually have the most amazing archive of street art. But the thing that doesn't actually make sense is that, like, the whole process of gentrification, you have an area, you have one bar, you have a bunch of artists, they create the culture of the place, be it, murals or whatever, and then you move rich people in, kick the artists out once the artists have made it a groovy place. I mean, it actually doesn't make sense to erase that culture that's been created. If anything, it actually raises the value of an area. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me.
I was wondering, the costs that you've been talking about, including the costs of putting the art in place, is one thing that there's a lifetime for these works of art, and I wonder how perhaps the 2 ladies in the middle might be able to answer how you've gone about thinking of the future and the fact that these works of art have to be protected and repainted and so on.
Yeah, certainly that's a really big factor, especially with something, for instance, like Tony's project. That is something that, as Tony said, we hope and I think confidently expect will be loved by the community, and there'll be a real obligation on the council to care for it to a standard that the community would expect. But it is often difficult because with the tagging and things like that can happen, just random acts that are not necessarily motivated by anything in particular. One of the surfaces or one of the materials is corten, and that's can be quite difficult to remove without any trace, and also to not leave a ghost of what was there before. So, but in the course of, it's been an interesting conversation for me anyway, having it with Tony and Peter, and the city gets on conservation advice too about such matters. But it was, sort of actually starting to understand, talking about the layering of the history and the layering of those stories, that in fact, I mean, you don't want an obscenity there because of, as Barbara was saying, there's certain people can look at it, community expectation, but the kind of, one way of looking at it is that it's sort of contributing to this layering, this sort of the patina of the city upon a work. And, I don't know what I think about that at the moment, but it's something just to sort of think about, that works change and evolve.
My own background, which is in engineering, it's very hard to get money in the future. And perhaps these things don't have a life of work.
Yeah, no, I think they're sort of, what is meant by permanent is, of course, a very, but there is a very, why the city, of course, looks into this so much is because, rightly so, they have a very real duty of care into the future. So everything that they commit to looking after, if it's a permanent work of this nature, has to be something that they can confidently say that they will be able to look after.
Yeah. And there's so much more sophisticated advancements. So as an artist, you have potential to so much more material that 10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago, would have been completely out of the question. And now the councils and people are very open to these various materials, because there are now such greater options, greater advances in technology in erasing things, in chemical compounds that do certain things that can erase something without affecting it. So, as an artist, I was really surprised by the broad spectrum of materials that were actually available. It didn't have, a public artwork doesn't have to be just a big block of bronze anymore. And, it goes far to say is, if your intent or your, what you were doing was actually that amazing, it wouldn't be out of the question to even propose, something helium-based, or something that had to be inflated every day. That's actually we have those opportunities now for those things to kind of happen. So it's changing, or an LED kind of light work.
That's right. I find that 25 years is often given as a longevity that we strive for. Happens to be part of the city's briefing materials now for the project I'm doing. And it's been the figure we've arrived at in some of these property development projects as well. But I think it is a really interesting question because, I think maybe a review, perhaps after 25 years, you might find that a future generation is no longer interested in a work, or conversely, very attached to one. We had a discussion yesterday in another project I'm working on with an artist who's very intelligent. She herself said she works, with kind of content and figurative imagery, that her work would expire. She doesn't want it to become dull. So how does she, on what schedule, and how is it updated? And we got into a, rather profound conversation, given who was participating. You wouldn't have believed that those people, I don't know, it was quite interesting from, lots of stakeholders, so to speak. We went through both sides of that. Well, what if we do become attached to it? But then, what if a new building goes up and it's not appropriate? I find that argument very problematic. I want to defend the art, and I think it's very good in a contract, an artist's contract, to have a period like 25 years, which is substantial, and nothing can happen to that work of art. It cannot be removed, in any way damaged during that period. I think you have to have, that has to be a basic, it's a basic respect for the artist and for what they're making.
Yeah, and I think all of that's in the contract. You have to have a maintenance plan. You have to prove that your materials will last. You don't win the tender otherwise. It all has to be worked out first. And if I can use Kimberlane as an example, that's an interesting one because it is actually labelled as a semi-permanent work. So the mural component and the painting on the floor, it will decay, it will get graffitied, other artists will contribute to the work, to the walls as well. But in terms of material, we had a limited budget, so the contract actually stated 3 to 5 years, and so we're legally obliged to make it last for 3 to 5 years. But the team that I worked with, we were like, okay, well let's invest a little bit of our own money back into it, and so to make it last 10 years, because I'm like, well, if it's going to go up, I want it to last as long as possible. So the dye bond material we use, that is guaranteed for 10 years. The lighting is waterproof, guaranteed to last for 10 years. So when my 5 years is up, I might negotiate with the council and say, well, my term is up. Do you want to pay me for another 5 years? Because it's going to last another 5 years.
We had a similar, I suppose an equal but opposite situation with Rico's, where Rico wanted to use a fluoro pink paint on the T2 building, which had an external life of 6 months, which just happened to be the life of the commissioned work, and the recommissioning or the extension of the commission meant that it had to be repainted. So the artists are totally aware, or these days, of the life of a work and the maintenance that's required, but also the commissioning agreement can make provision for relocation and storage, or the destruction of the work at the end of particular period of time. But very much with Tony's work, the meetings that we're having with council and the people that are going to take on the long-term maintenance of this work is around its longevity. And although the 25 years is in the contract, the real intent is that it never goes away, and that I think public art probably goes away through an extension of that consultation process. So there will be an ongoing consultation after all work's finished that determines its relevance and whether it stays or goes. But just in terms of its kind of physical maintenance, it's budgeted, it's considered, it's designed, and it's understood. And it's kind of driving us crazy at the moment.
Yeah.
It's good. Yeah, it's all...
I think that's all we have time for tonight. I'm sure there's many more questions, but time is of the essence. So if you'd all like to join me in thanking this great panel.